us this morning as we study your word. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, so we are in Matthew chapter 10. I guess I'm starting to see what Pastor was talking about, how it's like you're looking here, but everybody's over here. I see why he moved over on Wednesday. So I might turn just a little bit so I don't feel as awkward. But we are in Matthew chapter 10 this morning, and we're going to be looking at the disciples' manual here in chapter 10. Now, this is, to be honest, this is a big chapter, and there's some pretty deep water, and it's Sunday school, and we go one chapter at a time, so we're going to be treading lightly through deep water, to put it shortly. But Matthew chapter 10, we'll just begin off by reading verses 1 through 23. Beginning in verse 1. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits, to cast them out, and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: the first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the publican, James the son of Alphaeus, and Labius, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent forth, and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as ye go, preach, saying, The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils. Freely ye have received, freely give. Provide neither gold nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor scrip in your journey, neither 2 coats, neither shoes, nor yet staves. For the workman is worthy of his meat. And into whatsoever city or town ye shall enter, inquire who in it is worthy, and there abide till you go thence. And when ye come into a house, salute it. And if the house be worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it be not worthy, let your peace return to you. And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when you depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust off your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in that day of judgment than for that city. Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be therefore wise as serpents, and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues, and ye shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, take no thought how or what you shall speak, for it shall be given you in the same hour what you shall speak. For it is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. And the brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child, and children shall rise up against their parents, and cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that endureth to the end shall be saved. But when they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another. For verily I say unto you, ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. So as we look at this lesson this morning in chapter 10. Chapter 10 is a very deep and very wide chapter. It's probably one of the more difficult chapters, I would say, in the book of Matthew, because as Matthew records Jesus's command of them going out, he's getting ready to send them out to go out and do their mission journey, essentially, and then come back to him. When he gets ready to send them and he gives them these commandments, it would seem somewhat confusing, because he gives them this very long commandment talking about all these different things that are going to happen that don't necessarily happen on their trip. He talks about parents turning over parents, and this person turning over that person, and that that there's going to be many that will die, and he gives these different events. But when you look at it in the perspective of understanding the way, and I like the way the lesson breaks it down, he actually is talking about different eras of disciples. And you'll see that as we go through, that he's actually talking about the 12 apostles in front of him, the disciples that would be in the future, that would be during the tribulation, the great tribulation, and then he's talking about the present disciples at this time. Because if you were to try to apply everything they said all the way till now, you would be saying that we were only to go to the Jews and not to anyone else. And then if you were to only apply it to, and if you were only to apply it to today's standard, There would be a lot of stuff that doesn't fit. So that when you look at it in that context of understanding that he's talking to basically giving marching orders to disciples from that moment all the way until the tribulation, it makes a whole lot more sense. But essentially what he was giving these disciples was a training manual. He was trying to teach them what they were to do in their service for God. And in many ways, this chapter, again, can be a little bit more difficult if you don't understand in that context. And I guess the best way to compare this is it's the same way when you look at the Bible and you don't understand it within the fact that God was speaking to different people at different times. We call it dispensationalism. In other words, there was a dispensation where God was dealing specifically with the Jews. There was a dispensation where he was dealing with the New Testament church. And if you look at it in that perspective, this chapter makes a whole lot more sense. But when we look at the first section here, verses 1 through 23, we're going to see that this section that he's dealing with here deals with the different eras of different disciples, not errors, but eras of disciples. In this section, he's going to go through and he's going to show us that there's apparently, again, differences in what he was commanding these disciples to do. We look at the instructions, first of all, to the past disciples, and we read it already, but in verses 1 through 15, when he talks to them, he said specifically speaking to the 12 apostles, and he makes commands to them, again, that would make no sense to us today. When he talks about the fact that, look, let me find it real quick here. Here he goes in verse 8, he says, heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils. Does that apply to us today? No, because we don't have that. We don't have the gift of the apostles. The apostles were literally given a gift to where they had the ability to lay hands on a person and heal them. I wish we had that gift. I know Benny Hinn thinks he does. But unfortunately, we don't literally have the ability to just lay a hand on someone and bam, they're healed. Now, we know that our Lord has the ability to heal people. We can pray and God does that, but he doesn't physically give the gift to just, bam, you're healed. If you did, you'd have a TV show too. But that gift, again, it was a specific command to these apostles. It was a gift given to them. And of course, if we were to look a little bit further into that, we know that even towards the end of Paul's life and the other disciples, they had lost that gift themselves because, when Paul talked about some of the issues with himself, he couldn't heal himself. And when he talked about issues with Timothy, instead of just coming up and just healing Timothy of his stomach problems, he said, look, you're going to have to take a little wine for your infirmity. So again, we know that was dealing with that era of disciples. It was the era of the past disciples, or specifically the apostles. Matthew is clear again who he's speaking to, because he said in verse 2, he talked to the apostles. And, in a narrow sense, the apostles were the ones who had specifically seen Jesus. They were there with him from the beginning. They witnessed his death and his resurrection. Now, we know that one of them fell kind of out of that, Paul, but again, he was on the backside of the desert. He did get to spend that time with Jesus himself. But these people were given special powers. They were given unique authority. In the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, chapter 12 and verse 12, he describes a little bit of their special, unique ability and authority that they've been given that, of course, we don't have the same. In chapter 12, verse 12 of 2 Corinthians, he said, truly the signs of an apostle were wrought among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. He said, so they were given gifts that were to be a sign of their apostleship. And I know you may hear today people that call themselves apostle this or apostle that. Not trying to be funny, but that's a gross inaccurate use of the term. There is no apostle today. And if there was, you better start showing me the sign gifts. And unfortunately, you can't. So no, that doesn't make you an apostle. It makes you a disciple, but not an apostle. Mm-hmm. And so we know that they were given unique gifts that God said, when you go out, I want you to do this. He said, basically, Jesus had gone about healing people, and we read that up till Matthew chapter 9. He'd gone about healing people. He said, now I give you the power to do the same thing. In fact, he specifically said, what was given to you freely, give out freely. That's another trick to the Benny Hinn problem, in my opinion. Because if the gift of healing was given to him, why didn't he apply it the same way that he told the apostles to apply it? He said, I've given you the gift freely, don't you go charging for the gift. I gave to you freely, now give freely to everyone else. And again, the people that claim to have that never seem to get the second part. They claim they've got the healing, but they forget the whole I gave it to you freely, so you need to give it out freely. But he talks specifically again to these past disciples, these apostles. They were the people originally commissioned to go out, and again, where were they to go? They were to go to one specific area. He said, verse 6, but go rather to the lost sheep of Israel, of the house of Israel. So he commissioned them specifically to go to one group, one people. And we know that when Jesus would die on the cross, he would rent the temple, he would rent the veil in the temple from top to bottom, and he would welcome in the Gentiles at this point, and that would change everything. But up until this point, that is not who they were called to go to. They were called to gather his sheep, to bring his people together. So again, the first era that he was speaking to was the era of the past disciples. The second era of disciples that he's going to speak to in verses 16 through 23 would be the era of future disciples. These aren't the original 12. These aren't the original people they won, but instead it would be the people that would be won that would make it to that point of tribulation. And as he deals with that section, he's dealing with it in verse 16 through 23. He talks specifically, he said in verse, in verse 21, and brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child, and the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that endureth to the end shall be saved. Now we know that he's not just talking to regular disciples, because what do you mean enduring to the end? You're saying, in other words, if you'll be a good disciple until you finally make it to your point of death, then you'll be saved. That's not what he's talking about. When he says endure to the end, he's talking about the tribulation. He said if you can survive to the end of the tribulation, if you can endure to the end, you will be saved. And of course, that's going to mean a whole lot more to people in the tribulation than it does to us. You know, if you tell someone, hey, just endure to the end, you go, are you just talking about my bursitis or just talking about enduring to the end of this? No, he's talking specifically again to those people because it means a whole lot more to them when you say endure to the end. I'm glad that we're not going to have to be there through that, but if you were, that would be a strong promise to hold on to. So again, he's speaking to these disciples that will be in the future, that will be during the time of this tribulation. They will be encouraged again with the mention of the Lord's return. So that's why he mentions it there in verse 22 and 23. But the third era of disciples that really pertains mostly to us is going to be found in verses 24 through 42. And this is the era of present disciples. In other words, you and me right now. This era is especially important to us because it doesn't pertain to the original apostles. It doesn't pertain to those that would be during the tribulation. This section tells exactly what Jesus expects of us as 21st century, current modern day disciples of God. So we're going to move from talking about the different eras of disciples here in verses 24 through 42, and we're going to look at the equipment given to disciples today. So we're going to look at this equipment. Jesus was always open and upfront with disciples. He never got someone to follow them by using trickery. He never told someone, hey, if you'll follow me, you'll have your best life now. In fact, he was very clear about his warning. You know, today, when you join the military, you're going to meet a recruiter, and the recruiter's going to sit down with you. He's going to tell you, son, or daughter, whatever your name is, you know, I'm going to tell you what, I got some great news for you. You wanted to travel the world, didn't you? Oh man, the military is going to pay for you to see the whole world, one dirt ball at a time. You know, we're going to get you to see the whole world, and you want to go to college, don't you? We're going to pay for you to go to college, and this, I'm telling you, this is going to make your whole life. And of course, they enter the military and realize, that dude tricked me. My goodness, did he trick me? Yeah, I get to see the whole world, one battlefield at a time. You know, and of course you get tricked, but the Lord did not ever introduce discipleship that way. He didn't sit there and say, you can have your best life now. If you'll follow me, this is a limited time offer, but if you'll call 1-800-discipleship and follow me, I'll promise you wealth, happiness, everything you could ever dream of in your life. Well, no, of course, that's not what he did. In fact, he specifically told them what trials they would face. He said, look, if you're going to follow me, you got to take up your cross. The cross was not a thing of punishment. No one took up the cross because it was something that was popular, because people really admired people who took up their cross. No, the cross was a place of death. So he said, when you take up your cross and follow me, what he's saying is, look, because of who I am, I died here on the earth. You are going to have to eventually be willing to make the same sacrifice. Pick up your cross and be ready to bear it. So again, he never made this promise to these disciples under false pretenses. And some churches emphasize mostly the positive features of being a Christian. Yes, there are positive features to being a Christian, but nevertheless it demands discipleship. And I think that's something that most of us miss when we talk about service to God. We talk about getting saved and getting out of heaven. Sure, that is a strong benefit of being saved. But ultimately it demands discipleship. And we know that he's very specific in what he expects of his disciples, and we're going to look at that later. But specifically, you remember he said, if you are not willing to hate not your mother, your father, he said, you cannot be, your own life. He said, you cannot be my disciple. That's some pretty strong words. You remember when Jesus is preaching to 5,000, the disciples get all excited. They go, man, Lord, this is happening. We're fixing to take over this country. You're going to become the ruler. And by the end of it, after he told them all of the prerequisites of being part of the kingdom, they all walked away. And you can imagine the disciples looking at him going, you've got to be kidding me. You had a prime opportunity. You had the crowd. You had their ear, and you had to go and say, eat of my body and drink my blood. Really? Come on now. But yet that's exactly what he does when he talks to these disciples, when he talks to people who would be disciples. He didn't sit there and sugarcoat it. He told them exactly what he would expect. And being a Christian, again, as we said, it's not a life insurance policy, but rather it's being a disciple. It means understanding the demands that have been placed on us as a believer. And Jesus gave his disciples 3 pieces of equipment that they could use in meeting the demands of being a disciple. He showed us, first of all, that the first piece of equipment we use is to realize the fact that true fear does exist. He said in verse 24, he said, the disciple is not above his master, nor the servant above his Lord. It is enough for the disciples that he be as his master and the servant as his Lord. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more shall they call them of his household? Fear them not, therefore, for there is nothing covered, but that shall not be revealed, and hid that it shall not be known. What I tell you in darkness, that speak ye in the light. What ye hear in the and what ye hear in the ear, that preach ye upon the housetops. And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And again in verse 31, fear ye not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows. So he uses 3 times, fear not, fear not. Why does he say fear not? Because there's something to be fearful of. He doesn't use that term lightly. If he says fear not, it's because there's a reason to be scared. You notice how when angels always showed up, what did an angel always have to tell a person when they show up? Fear not. Why? Because they were a scary sight to see. It was something frightful to see. So he said fear not multiple times. And why? Because he discusses this issue. And he said, verse 25 again, he said, if they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, or another name for Satan, how much more shall they call them of his household? Fear them not, therefore, for there's nothing covered that shall not be revealed, and hid that shall not be known. But I tell you in darkness, that speak ye in the light. So he said, look, he said, one of the things you have to understand is, as he names this issue, he said, you're going to be going into territory that's scary. You're going to be going to territory and serving me. That means you're going to go up against Beelzebub. The term Beelzebub, although it doesn't directly mean Satan, it means the Lord of the Flies. It follows the idea of death. It follows the idea, again, of Satan. He said, look, you're going to be going into his territory. He said, if the master of the house is called Beelzebub, he said, imagine how much more his servants. In other words, the people that don't serve God, and instead allow themselves to be controlled by Satan. He said, so not only do you have to know that he's the master of this house at this time, he said, but he's got those that work under him that you have reason to be scared. He said, but instead, don't be fearful of those that can kill the body, but instead be fearful of the one that can kill the body and the soul. But 3 times again in this section, he tells them, fear not. What causes the fear that he mentions? Well, the fear is persecution, ultimately. And that's exactly what he's talking about, is persecution. The ultimate cause of persecution, again, was Satan himself, as we just already recognized. But what he was trying to tell them, essentially, is being forewarned is being forearmed. The best news in the military you could ever have is knowing where the enemy is. Not because it means the enemy goes away. It doesn't make the enemy instantly no longer dangerous, but when you know where they are, you can be better prepared to deal with them. You know, I would imagine one of the scariest things that being a soldier over in Afghanistan and Iraq and those areas is when you enter a town and you don't know who or where the enemy is. If you've ever watched some of those military movies, I mean, it's downright scary walking into a city and you don't know if the next window is going to open with a gun or if it's going to open up with someone greeting you and telling you, we're so glad you're here. But ultimately, what he was trying to tell them, he said, I'm going to forewarn you that there are forces within this world that would work against you, that would persecute you, and ultimately would want to see your death. He said, but don't fear those that can kill the body. And I'll tell you, that's a hard thing to take. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, I generally am fearful of a gun in my face. Anybody else? I mean, I've been there, I've done that, I've had 2 guns in my face, and I can say it's a scary event. It's not enjoyable. And he said, fear not. That's a tough saying, I would say. But yet that's exactly what he warned. And you know, we know that there's evidence. You can go throughout history and read about men and women that have served God and ultimately to the point of death, and they stood death in the face fearless. Not because they were some tough person, but because they had the Spirit of God in them. And he said, fear not. He said, because while they can kill the body, they can't kill the soul. Another cause of persecution against the disciples, not only was it Satan himself, but we know that ultimately it would another cause of persecution would cause the disciples to develop moral courage in verses 26 through 28. Again, when he talked about that, you know, what I have told you in darkness, speak in the light. What you've heard in your ear, preach it upon the housetops. In other words, don't be afraid to speak. Don't be afraid to be a witness. Don't allow persecution to develop a situation where you close into yourself and you don't share the word of God with others. He said, what you've heard of me, he said, get on the housetop and shout it out. And I'd say that's something that's become one of the greatest problems in America is disciples of God have become quiet. Persecution, uncomfortableness. I mean, you talk about God in any public venue and you instantly get shut down. You declare yourself to be a Christian and they will do everything they can to dig up every piece of history you've ever had. Because why? They want to shut you down. They want you to be quiet. They don't want you to speak up for the name of God. He said, what you've heard of me, he said, I want you to shout it out. I don't want you to be silent and go along with the world, because ultimately that's a sure way to persecution. Because, of course, the more quiet we are, the louder everyone else gets. But as he talks about this, he said, you know, if we live for Jesus openly and honestly before a watching world, we have to display moral courage, but again, physical courage, because he said in verse 28, there are people that their desire would be to kill your body. He said, but fear them not. So, you know, what is the remedy for this, for disciples keeping themselves from living in fear? Well, he said it's the protection that he promises. He said in verse 29, are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not, therefore, ye are more valued than many sparrows. You ever think about that? He said, I attend the funeral service of every sparrow. I know it sounds funny to say. He said, there's not a sparrow that falls that I wasn't there when it happened. So the Lord said, when just a simple bird passes away, he said, I was there to witness it. He said, if I'm there to witness even the death of something as simple as a sparrow, something as simple and worthless as that, by the world standard, he said, I know every hair on your head. He said, don't think that where you are, I'm not also. Don't think that I don't know what you're going through. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that he's going to fix every situation, that we're going to make it out fine, that because we serve God, that everything's going to be made right. I'll be honest, I had that misconception earlier in my life. And, you know, just like anyone else, you have that misconception. One day that misconception is going to bite you, because something's going to go wrong and God's not going to magically fix it. And it's going to shake your faith until you either, one, walk away, or two, you grow stronger and realize that it was a misconception, and that was where I had to live. And it's where I had to be until I got that right. But ultimately he said, look, just as the sparrow falls, he said, I know you. I see you. I'm with you. And ultimately we have to understand that that's what gives us our strength, our ability to not fear. Why was it that Peter stood fearful when Jesus was being getting ready to be crucified, when they were interrogating him and judging him? He said, I don't know the man. And yet, when the Holy Spirit entered him, you find him just a short time later, standing before a whole crowd preaching, saying, "I don't care what you do to me. Let me tell you about my Lord." What was the difference? How was he so fearful then, and he was not fearful later? Why? Because he had the Holy Spirit within him, and he had the power of God, and he knew he was with him. So as he uses this, he understands that we tell us again that the way that we deal with our fear is knowing that God is with us, knowing he's carefully watching over us, and that he knows even the very hairs on our head. The second piece of equipment he gives his disciples, as he tells us to be familiar with the foes that attack us. In verses 32 through 39, he speaks directly of these foes. He said in verse 36, "A man's foes shall be they of his own household." You know, I don't say this to be disparaging, but you know, when I got saved, my whole family didn't get excited for me. They weren't pumped about it. They weren't encouraging me. You know, they for the most part left me alone. But I still remember, I use this example, and I don't say this to pick on my sister, but I was very involved in church. I was at church because I was in college. I was at church Monday night for college till about 9:30, Tuesday night till 9:30, Wednesday night till 9:30, 10:30 for church, then Thursday night for class, Friday night for class, then Saturday morning for visitation, and then Sunday for church. And it was pretty much, I lived at the building just about. And I remember Christmas came, and Christmas fell on a Sunday. And my sister said, "You're going to go to church on Christmas? Really, do you guys ever take anything off? You practically live there." And I remember telling her, "Well, Christmas is kind of a celebration of his birth." Oh, yeah. I guess you got me there. It was, and of course, by no means did I deal with any kind of persecution like some people, like a Jew. When a Jew would get saved, they would bury a casket in their name and count them as dead. Why? Because they chose to serve Jesus. He said, so some of the times the enemies that you'll deal with, the foes, will be those of your own house. He said, he showed how the disciples were to view the foes that were to come against him. He gave them basically three filters that the disciple has to use when viewing their foes. First of all, we have to choose to filter our view of our foes through our loyalty of Christ. He said in verse 32 through 33, "Whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess also before my Father which is in heaven. But whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven." Now, I'll tell you, that's a hard phrase to take. He said, look, if you'll openly be willing to say to openly proclaim that you are my son, that you're my follower, that you're a son or daughter of Christ, he said, I'll openly proclaim you before my Father. He said, but if you're going to deny me, he said, I'll deny you just as well. It's kind of a hard section to talk about, but that's exactly why he said, when you're dealing with your foes, when you're dealing with those that would attempt to assuage you from service to God, he said, be willing to speak for me, because he said, those that are of my household, those that I stand up for, are those that are willing to speak my name before their foes. He tells us that we should be openly willing to confess or to acknowledge him as our Lord, and ultimately the one that governs our life. And that's not to say that if you're a believer and you're not quick to confess him, that you lose your salvation. If that was the case, then Peter would have lost his salvation when he was standing before those saying, I don't know the man. He's not talking about saved and unsaved. Why? Because he's talking to his disciples at this point. He said, but if you want me to be in your corner, he said, be willing to confess me. And he said, when you confess me, I'll confess you before my Father. On the other hand, he talks again about those who deny him, that go completely at odds with our Lord. He said, essentially, they demonstrate being ashamed of Jesus. And ultimately, there is scripture to back up the fact that people that are not serving God, that are not choosing to do God's will, and ultimately are a servant of God, the fact that some of them have slept early. In other words, they've gone to an early grave. Because essentially, if they don't want to be used of God, then he said that you're of no use. But when he looks at this, when he talks about these disciples that are willing to stand for him, he said, when you're willing to stand for me, I'm willing to stand for you. And brings you back to the memory of Stephen. When Stephen was preaching and the people got so mad at him, they began stoning him, and they came upon him in Acts chapter 7. They were literally gnawing on him. That's a hard scene to picture. Can you imagine you're standing there preaching to a group of people? And like Pastor said, I've had people get mad at me. I've had people threaten to punch me out, wave canes at me, threaten to shoot me. I've never had people get so mad they came and physically gnawed on me. But they came up and they were that angry. And as he was getting ready to die, you read about Stephen, chapter 7, verse 44. He looks up at heaven, and what was Jesus doing? Anybody remember? He stood. And what makes that so unique is the fact that every other time you find Jesus, you find him sitting at the right hand of the Father. So the fact that he was standing meant he chose to do something outside of the norm as he watched Stephen get ready to be crucified, get ready to be stoned to death because of his faith, because he spoke in the name of God. He stood. Again, that same picture of the person who's willing to stand for God, he said, I'm willing to stand for you. And I'm not saying that I want to be stoned to death, but I sure would like to know that I've done something in my life that's worthy of the Savior being willing to stand and say, that's my son. That's my daughter. And as he spoke, you could imagine the pride within Jesus as he looked at his father and said, that's one of mine. That's one of mine. So he said, when we view our foes, we're to view it through the filter of us understanding that we should be willing to confess God, so he confesses us as well. The second filter that we look through our foes is we should be looking at our problems of dealing with our foes through our love of Christ. He said in verse 34, think not that I am come to send peace on the earth. I am come not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes shall be they of his own household. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. So as he's describing this love, he said, you are to love me more than any other. Because ultimately, if you love God more than you love even your own family, when they make you make a choice between serving God or them, the choice becomes, I've got to serve God. Why? Because my love for him is so much more that even though it hurts me to separate, I have to do the right thing. I have to serve God. I'll tread lightly through this since I'm on being recorded, but there's someone within my family that I had to have that same discussion with. It was a discussion because of choices they've made that are unscriptural and unbiblical, and I remember having to sit down with them and have a conversation and tell them, look, I love you, but you're wrong, and I love you, but unfortunately I'm not going to allow my kids to have full influence over my kids. Now, this person sees my children, but they don't have the same allowance of influence as other people within my family because of their choices. And that was a very hard conversation to have. It was a very, very, very hard conversation to have. But ultimately, I had to choose my love for my Savior over the love for even that person. And he said, ultimately, when you're being a disciple, and you're dealing with foes, even within your own house, you have to choose to love God more than you even love them. And there's been a whole lot of people that when their kids decided that they didn't want to go to church anymore, they didn't want anything to do with it, they followed their kids. Their kids wanted to play soccer or baseball or do this or that. They showed their love for their kids to be stronger than their love for God because they said, well, they don't want to be at church, they'd rather do this, so I'm going to do this instead. He said a person, when they're dealing with these issues, they have to choose to love me more than they love anyone else. And the book of Luke, chapter 14, verse 26 through 27, carried the same idea. In the book of Luke, chapter 14, they're really quick. I know we're running low on time. But Luke, chapter 14, and verse 26 through 27, he carries the same exact thought through. When he said, if any man come to me, and hate not his father or mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, in his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So essentially what he's saying is when it comes to loving me, there can be no rival. There can be no one that stands above me. I know love in this world, it's a highly regarded thing, and it's a beauty to see a man or a woman that loves their spouse so much they're willing to sacrifice anything for their spouse. But ultimately, he said, as beautiful as that is, your love for me should be greater. It should be stronger. And again, as he speaks this, he tells us that our love for God should be greater than our love for our own household. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't care or we neglect them. No, ultimately, because when we love God, He commands us to take care of our household. So it's not that we neglect them, but He said ultimately your love and your loyalty should be to me first. And the third filter that we view our problem with our foes is supposed to be our life in Christ. He said specifically in verse 38, he said, "He that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me." He says, so ultimately, when we're dealing with our foes, when we're dealing with our problem as a disciple, he said we ought to be willing to take up our cross and follow him. And again, as we've said, cross was not a means of torture. No, they didn't put you up on the cross to torture you and then take you back down. It was the end. It was the end of your life. It was the finishing. It was your death. It was to be a means of torture to the point of death. And so when Jesus speaks of taking up our cross, he means we are to literally be willing to lay our life on the altar of serving God. And that doesn't always mean you're going to die doing it, but that means that we're willing to die to self. You know, as he said, that I die daily. It's a daily thing. That means we have to be willing to die to our plans, to our desires, to our own direction, because he becomes the number one ruling choice in your life. I remember when I moved down to Columbus, Georgia, I did not come here to live. I did not come here to stay. I've heard before that this place has something in the water, and once you get here, you can never leave. It's the world's biggest trap, and they might not be wrong, but when I came down here to go to college and go back to Massachusetts, and I was going to do automotive work. This was a temporary stopping place from August of 2003. I've been stopped here for a minute, but I was supposed to be a temporary stopping place. When I got saved, I was going to college and I was learning welding, and my next step was to move into the automotive side to learn the mechanical side so that I could go back and work in a shop doing engine building and things like that. When the Lord saved me, I was almost done with my welding certificates, and I was just getting ready to swap over to the automotive side. And ultimately, God changed the plan, and he put me into the college. In fact, I could literally say I was kind of tricked into it, because I was invited to go somewhere with a group of the college kids. Come to find out, when I show up, I was invited to one of the classes. It was a dirty, rotten trick, and I'm serious. I was literally tricked into college. But after I went for that first one, I was saying, why don't you come back for the next one? And eventually I went through that whole semester auditing the class, and then I joined the college the next semester that started. But the Lord literally took my plans and wills and wishes and said, that's not what I will or wish for you. And he changed it. And he said, ultimately, being a disciple of God means laying aside your dreams, your desires, and then instead being willing to focus on what God has. And when it really comes down to it, there's only two alternatives for a Christian to consider. We either choose to spare our life and live for ourselves, or instead we choose to be a person that sacrifices our life for God. And he said, ultimately, those that choose to try to save their life will lose it. He said, but those that are willing to lose their life for me, he said, ultimately they gain. And of course, that's part of the conundrum of being a Christian. That makes no sense to the world. But discipleship, we know that lastly, it's demanding. It involves a crisis. It's ultimately, we have to choose, are we going to take up our cross or not? And it's not a one-time thing. We know that he said it was a daily thing. And Luke 9:23, he'd say the same thing. But the last piece of equipment he gives the disciple is the support of our friends. And verses 40 through 42, he that receiveth you receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. And he that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he that receiveth a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whosoever shall give a drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall in no wise lose his reward. He said, so part of the encouragement in being a disciple, he said it comes down to those that are serving alongside us, those that are serving with us. He said that our friends and their support of us and our support back of them is part of what enables us to get through with being a disciple of God. And the fact is, not everyone will reject our witness. He said that he that receiveth you receiveth me. There are those that would be willing to receive us, but also, of course, receive the Lord in his testimony. And he said, ultimately, when they welcome us, they welcome him as well. But we see that the fact that when someone treats one of these people, he said, when you treat them with respect, when you do something for them, he said, you've done it unto me. He said, if you minister to a pastor comes through and he's trying to, be, or a missionary, for example, when Brother Horton was here, when Brother Horton comes through and he's a missionary and he's a disciple to those in Canada, he said, when you do something to be a blessing to him, he said, ultimately you receive a reward of his blessing as well. He said, so part of what enables us to get through being a disciple and struggle and the strife that we get through is not only our friends in Jesus, but also the understanding of the reward to come. But in this chapter, again, like I said, this is something that could easily be preached on probably multiple sermons. It's pretty deep water, but I hope we did a good job of at least skimming through the surface of chapter 10. I know Pastor would have made a whole series out of chapter 10. And if this was his Sunday school, there have been multiple lessons on this one too. But in any case, as he's speaking to us of the disciples' manual, again, understanding we will have foes, but knowing the fact he watches over us, that there's a reward to those that serve him, and that ultimately we're not to fear those that can kill the body, but instead fear the one that has power over our eternity, over our soul, which of course we know is our Lord. Well, it is time for us to finish, so let's go and let's pray. Lord, I do pray, thank you for Lord, the fact that as disciples of God, Lord, we know you were blunt with us. You didn't make us promises that everything will be perfect. Lord, you told us the truth. But ultimately, Lord, you also promised us an eternity in heaven, Lord, in that holy city, Lord. You promised us that where we are, you would be also. Lord, just as the sparrow, when it falls, you're there to witness it, Lord. You're there with us as well when we serve you and ultimately when our life comes to an end. Lord, I pray that you be with us as we go about our day, Lord. Help us to pick up that cross and to carry it daily, Lord, and be willing to die to our desires and our will, and Lord, instead to